At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Aijalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven, and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord obeyed the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Some of you might be familiar with the story of King Canute and the tide. King Canute was an 11th century king of England, Denmark, and Norway. And one day he became increasingly exasperated with his courtiers who were praising him because of how powerful and how majestic he was. And eventually he snapped and he instructed them to set his throne on the edge of the sea, and then he proceeded to sit down on the throne. He then commanded the sea to turn back and to not wet his robes. And of course, the tide continued in its relentless fashion, and Canute got extremely wet. And he then proceeded to tell his courtiers that the power of earthly kings is vain and limited, and that the divine power of God, who rules the elements, is supreme over all. In Joshua chapter 10, we see God's power, God's authority, God's supremacy over human kings, and not just over human kings, but over nature itself. And so this evening, we're continuing our studies in people who prayed, and I want us to look at this prayer of Joshua, Joshua's prayer for victory. And we're going to divide the passage under two headings. We're going to look at the appeal to Joshua and then the appeal from Joshua. So you've got the appeal to Joshua, then the appeal from Joshua. First, the appeal to Joshua, verses 1 to 8. Here the author focuses on the plea that Joshua received. Before proceeding, we can note the context. The book of Joshua is a historical record of Israel settling in the land that the Lord had promised to give to their fathers, their ancestors. In Joshua 1 to 5, we read about the people entering the land. Joshua 5 to 12, we read about the people taking the land. Joshua 13 to 21, we read about the people allotting the land. And then in Joshua 22 to 24, we read about the people making preparations for living in the land. And all of this takes place against the backdrop, and Kevin touched on it in his prayer, takes place against the backdrop of Israel fighting and attempting to drive out the present inhabitants of the land. Now, having noted the context, we can see the deadly coalition in verses 1 to 5. We see the reaction. Look at verses 1 and 2. We're introduced to Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem. And Adonizedek hears about how Joshua had captured the cities of Ai and Jericho and had devoted them to destruction. He also hears about how the inhabitants of the city of Gibeon had made peace with Joshua. They had entered into a covenant, a binding agreement with him. And this causes Adonizedek to fear greatly. He's fearful because he knows that Gibeon is a great city. He's fearful because he knows that Gibeon is like one of the royal cities. He's fearful because he knows that Gibeon was a greater city than Ai. And he's fearful because he knows that all of Gibeon's men are warriors. And so after he'd seen the reaction, we hear the request. Look at verse 3 and 4. Adonizedek sends word to 4 kings. Horam, the king of Hebron, Piram, the king of Jarmuth, Japhir, the king of Lachish, and Debir, the king of Eglon. And he asks them to come up and help and let them strike Gibeon. And the reason that he provides for his request is because Gibeon has made peace with Joshua and with Israel. As far as Adonizedek is concerned, the Gibeonites are traitors. They have collaborated with a foreign invading force. And so he reasons that they ought to be struck down to punish them but also they should be struck down to serve as a deterrent for any other tribe, any other group that might think of entering into a similar covenant, a similar treaty with Joshua and Israel. And after hearing the request, we see the response. Look at verse 5. The kings of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon gather their forces together, and once they've gathered their forces together, they encamp against Gibeon and make war against it. It's a deadly coalition. We move, though, from the deadly coalition to the desperate call in verses 6 to 8. We hear another request. Look at verse 6. Adoni-Zedek had asked for help from his allies, and now the people of Gibeon ask for help from Joshua and Israel, their new allies. And the appeal that they make is very simple. They ask Joshua to come up to us quickly and save us and help us. And as they present the request, they highlight that the kings of the Amorites have all come up against them. After hearing the request, we see the response. Look at verse 7. In the previous chapter, we read about how the Gibeonites had tricked and deceived Joshua and Israel into entering into this covenant with them, this binding agreement with them. But when Joshua receives the appeal for help, he doesn't shrug his shoulders. He doesn't turn away. He doesn't say, well, they're going to get their just deserts. Instead, he and Israel meet the request with an immediate, fully committed response. We read that they assemble all the men of war. We read that they assemble all the men of valor. And we read that they went up to Gibeah from Gilgal. And after seeing the response, we hear the reassurance. Look at verse 8. The Lord now steps into the story, and he speaks. And he speaks to Joshua. And he starts by commanding Joshua not to be afraid. He continues by telling Joshua that he is giving all these kings into his hand. And he concludes by telling Joshua that not one of these men will be able to stand against him. It is a glorious word of reassurance as Joshua prepares to take on this deadly coalition. Now, friends, as we consider these verses, we're being shown repeated promises. Repeated promises. That's what we see in Joshua 10. If you go all the way back to Joshua 1, we find the Lord commanding Joshua at the very start of his service to be strong, to be courageous, and he informs him that no man will be able to stand against him all the days of his life. That's Joshua 1. And now in Joshua 10, we find the Lord commanding Joshua not to be afraid, to be strong, to be courageous, and he informs him that he is giving all these kings into his hand, and none will be able to stand against him. What we have here is a wonderful picture of repeated promises. And that's worth our attention tonight. In his commentary, Dale Ralph Davis writes this: such is the usual way God has of reassuring his children, not by unveiling to them some new truth previously unknown, but by reaffirming promises that he has already given, which somehow take on special power because of the present pressing need. This is what God's people usually need. Not new truth, but old truth, freshly applied to their current need. Did you catch that? Old truths, freshly applied to current needs. And I'm sure that that's been the experience of many of you, maybe all of you in this building tonight. You heard some truth about the Lord and his gospel in the past. And then after some time, a particular trouble, a particular trial came into your life. And it turned your life almost completely upside down. And that old gospel truth that you had learned so many years ago, that you had heard so many years ago, that you had taken to heart so many years ago, met your present need. I can think of one of our oldest members in High Free who spoke to me about her own experience. Her husband was dying of a very aggressive terminal cancer. And during those harrowing weeks, she was sustained by Jesus' words that he spoke to the disciples in the storm. You remember when he comes to the disciples in the storm and says to them, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Now, this woman had heard that story, learned that story, memorized those words probably 70, maybe even 80 years previously. But they came to her with fresh power, renewed power in her dark season, her difficult season. It was an old truth freshly applied to a current need. So this evening, friends, as we gather for worship, as we gather for prayer, let's pause and reflect on the wonder of repeated promises. That we don't need new words from God. We don't need new revelations from God. We don't need prophets to appear on the scene and tell us fresh visions and revelations from God. We simply need to rely on the repetition of his promises. But then we have the appeal from Joshua, and that's in verses 9 to 15, where the author focuses now on the plea that Joshua made. In verses 9 to 11, we see the route. We can begin by looking at the action of Joshua in verse 9. The author tells us that Joshua came upon the Amorite army suddenly, and they were able to do so because they had marched all night from Gilgal. And at this point, it's interesting to note, isn't it, that Joshua and the people actually act. They have been told by the Lord not to be afraid. They've been told by the Lord that he has given their enemies into their hand. They've been told by the Lord that no man will be able to stand against them. But that doesn't prohibit, that doesn't prevent them from actually doing something. Instead, they, like the missionary William Carey, attempt great things for God, even as they expect great things from God. And isn't that maybe even relevant for our own situation? That we believe in a God of power, but we don't sit back and hope that people will come into this church and be saved. But we actually go out to them. We reach out to them. We bring the gospel to them. We look for ways of touching them with the good news about Jesus. We expect great things from God, yes, but we also attempt great things for him. And after seeing the action of Joshua, we see the action of the Lord. Look at verse 10 and 11. We read that the Lord threw Adonizedek and his allies into panic. Back in Exodus chapter 14, we read that the Lord threw Pharaoh and the Egyptians into panic at the Red Sea. Now, 40 years later, history is repeating itself as the Lord throws Adonizedek and his allies into panic. And that allows Israel, we read, to strike them with a great blow. Isn't it interesting that Adonizedek wanted to strike Gibeon with a blow? And now what's happening? He's been struck with a great blow. And it allows Israel to chase them and strike them as far as Azekah and Makkedah, a distance of about 30 miles. We also read that the Lord threw down large stones from heaven so that more of Adonizedek's army died because of the hailstones than Israel killed with the sword. Back in Exodus chapter 9, we read about the Lord striking Pharaoh and Egypt with hailstones. And now here in Joshua 10, history is repeating itself 40 years later as the Lord is destroying Adonizedek and his army with hailstones. What's been made very clear then is this is the Lord's war. This is the Lord who's acting. This is the Lord who is a warrior and taking charge and giving Israel the victory. After seeing the route, we see the request in verses 12 to 14. The author tells us what Joshua did. Look at verse 12. We read that Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel. And we read that Joshua spoke to the Lord in the sight of Israel. This is not a private prayer. This is a public prayer for the people of Israel to see, the people of Israel to hear. And and the author tells us what Joshua said. Look again at verse 12. As Joshua prays, he calls on the sun to stand still at Gibeon in the east, and he calls on the moon to stand still in the valley of Ajalon in the west. It's just poetic language. Joshua is praying that the day will not end until Israel have had a final decisive victory. It's almost like a football match. Sorry if this sounds very trivial, but it's like a football match where your team is very much on the ascendancy, and you don't want the referee to blow the whistle for halftime or for full time. You want the match to keep on going so that, well, ideally Rangers get an absolute victory, especially if it's over Celtic. That's for David's benefit. But you know what I mean. That's what the people are wanting. They're wanting this day of victory to go on and on and on. And the author tells us what happened. Verse 13 and 14. We read that the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. We read that this event is then recorded in the book of Joshua, presumably a document chronicling various events in Israel's history. And once again, we read that the sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. It's a remarkable event. It's a supernatural event. It's a cosmic event. But what's even more remarkable is what the author says next. Look at what the author says. He claims that there has never been a day like it or since when the Lord heeded or obeyed the voice of a man and fought for Israel. That is what captures the author's attention. That is what captivates the author's mind. That the Lord would actually listen to and act on the voice of a mere man. And after hearing the request, we see the return in verse 15. The rout is now over. Israel have emerged victorious, and so they return and they camp at Gilgal. The campaign isn't over. The remainder of Joshua 15 chronicles how Joshua would go on to pursue these 5 kings, capture them, and put them to death. But at this moment, there is a very brief interlude as Joshua and his army, who seem to have suffered no losses, return to their camp for rest and for refreshment. Now, friends, as we consider these verses, we're being shown not just repeated promises, but also sovereign power. Sovereign power. That's what we see in Joshua 10. Here we find the Lord throwing the Amorite army into panic and hurling stones at them so that many of them die. And here we also find the Lord causing the sun to remain in the heavens and not set in response to Joshua's prayer. What we have here is a picture of sovereign power. And again, that's worth our attention tonight. Donald Gray Barnhouse was a prominent preacher, and on one occasion he was asked to preach at Princeton Theological Seminary. And as he preached, he happened to see that his former Old Testament professor, Robert Dick Wilson, was sitting in the very front row. A bit like having Robert and Duncan right in front of your nose as you're trying to preach. But this was his former Old Testament professor. And he was listening very attentively as Barnhouse was preaching. And after the sermon, Robert Dick Wilson approached Barnhouse and he said this to him: "If you ever come back here again, I will not come to hear you preach. I only come once. I am glad that you are a big Godder. When my boys come back to the seminary, I come to see if they are big Godders or little Godders, and then I know what kind of ministry they will have." Barnhouse was somewhat confused, and he asked Wilson what he meant. And so Wilson explained, "Some men have a little God, and they're always in trouble with him. He can't do any miracles. He can't take care of the inspiration of the scriptures and their preservation and transmission to us. They have a little God, and I call them little Godders. Then there are those who have a great God. He speaks, and it is done. He commands, and it stands fast. He knows how to show himself strong on behalf of those that fear him. You, my friend, have a great God, and he will bless your ministry. You are a big Godder. Friends, the God of the Bible is a big God, a God of sovereign power. He's the one powerful enough to create the universe by the word of his power. The one powerful enough to sustain that universe, all the forces of nature, even the weather that we spend every day talking about, he sustains it by the word of his power. He's the one powerful enough to providentially govern every event in history, the major details, the minor details, the rise and fall of kings and kingdoms. He's the one who's powerful enough to restore and renew and redeem this whole groaning creation and bring it to his appointed end. And friends, it's important and it's imperative that we don't try reducing him down to a slightly larger version of ourselves, or even a smaller version of ourselves. This evening, as we gather for worship, as we gather for prayer, I want us to pause and reflect on the wonder of sovereign power. That we, friends, have a powerful God. We have a sovereign God. We have a big God. We have one who is mighty. We have one who could destroy that Amorite coalition, one who could stop the sun from setting on that day in Joshua's life. And friends, he hasn't changed. He is powerful. But as we consider these verses, we're not just shown repeated promises and not just shown sovereign power, but also we're shown answered prayer. That's what we see here in Joshua 10. In this chapter, we find Joshua praying that the sun would stand still. And the author, it's lovely, isn't it? He almost takes delight, the author, in informing his readers that the sun stood still. Why? Because the Lord heeded the voice of a man. It's a wonderful picture of answered prayer. And again, that's worth our attention tonight. You probably know the story of George Muller, 19th century evangelist with a great burden for vulnerable children. During his lifetime, Muller cared for over 10,000 orphans. He established 117 schools. He offered education to more than 120,000 children. He managed to set up 5 orphanages without asking for a single penny from anyone and not going into debt. And on one occasion, he was asked how he managed to do all this. And here's what Muller said. "No man on earth can say that I ever asked him for a penny. We have no committees, no collectors, no voting, no endowments. All has come in answer to believing prayer. My trust has been in God alone. He has many ways of moving the hearts of men to help us all over the world. While I am praying, God speaks to this one and to another, on this continent and on that, to send us help. Only the other evening, while I was preaching, a gentleman wrote me a check for a large amount of the orphanages and handed it over to me when the service was over." George Muller was a man who fully believed, firmly believed, in the fact that there is a God of sovereign power. And not just that he is a God of sovereign power, but that he is a God who answers prayer. Prayer is powerful. And it's powerful not because of the intellect of the one who's praying, or the eloquence of the one who's praying, or the passion of the one who's praying, or the length of the one who's praying. Prayer is powerful because it simply lays hold of the God who is full of sovereign power, the God who can do what seems to be impossible. And even when this God says no, or when he says not yet, it is still an answer, it is still a response from this God. Once again, quoting Dale Ralph Davis, "Isn't it amazing that God listens to the voice of a man or a woman who comes to him? Doesn't this view of prayer rebuke both the flippancy and the tedium with which we often approach the great King? Ought we not to catch our breath, to think that God, who is seated on high, stoops down and bends his ear to lips of dust and ashes? When he calls, "To me I will answer him," he says in Psalm 91. Who has ever heard of a God like that? So this evening, friends, as we gather for worship and as we gather for prayer, I want us to pause and reflect on the wonder of answered prayer. That tonight, friends, you and I, as we approach this God through Christ, he listens to the very dust of the earth. He listens to me. He listens to John, he listens to Kevin, and he listens to every single one of us. He listens to your public prayers, he listens to your private prayers, he listens to the prayers you cannot put into words but can only groan. And I really hope, friends, that that is an encouragement to you tonight. And I hope it would be an encouragement to you to keep on prioritizing coming to the prayer meeting, keeping on praying for the life of this congregation, and keeping on looking for new ways of meeting for prayer, to call on this God who is powerful and bends his ear to those who draw near to him. Let's sing the words of Psalm 28. Psalm 28, the Scottish Psalter version. And sing in verses 6 down to 9. Forever blessed be the Lord, for graciously he heard the voice of my petitions, and prayers did regard. The Lord's my strength and shield, my heart upon him did rely. And I am helped, hence my heart doth joy exceedingly. Psalm 28, verses 6 down to 9. And please do stand if you're able to. our Father, we thank you and bless you that you are the one who gives repeated promises in his word. You do not give fresh visions and revelations for us to rely on, but rather old truths to meet our current, present, and pressing needs. And we pray that if there are any here tonight who might be going through a time of trouble, a time of trial, difficulty, and discouragement, that the old truths of your word, the promises that you have previously given, would be a balm to their hearts, to their souls, and would meet their present needs. We thank you and we bless you that you are the God of sovereign power, the God sovereign over politics and nations, the God sovereign over the weather and over nature, and that there is nothing impossible for you, that you are the one who rules over all things and is always seated high and lifted up on the throne. And we praise and bless you that you are the one who hears the prayers, answers the prayers of his people. Maybe not in the ways that they want, maybe not in the ways that they expect, maybe not in the ways that they ask, but we thank you and bless you as we have just sung, that you are the God who does not turn a deaf ear to the cries and petitions that your people make. We thank you that just as you heard the voice of Joshua, so you hear the voices of all those who approach you in and through the one greater than Joshua, the Lord Jesus Christ, the one who is a perfect advocate and high priest for his people, and brings all their pleas and petitions and presents them in a perfect manner before the throne of grace. And so we pray now that you would part us with your blessing, that you would keep us in your love, and that we would be able to leave this building glad that we were here and encouraged in heart